Hello, my name is Matt, and welcome to the second video in this series where I'm teaching you guys how to create your own CI/CD pipelines on GitHub Actions. In this video, I'm teaching you how to control when your pipeline runs and how your pipeline runs with triggers on the YAML file. So for context, it's very important to minimize when a pipeline runs. So in this video, we will talk about the different trigger modes that you can have under the on section in your GitHub Actions definition file. Specifically, we will cover how you can run a pipeline on a new commit, how to limit your pipeline so it only runs on the creation or changes in a PR, running your pipelines on a schedule. So for example, you want to run a nightly build at midnight every day, how you can allow your pipeline to be triggered manually on the Actions UI, and how to call your pipeline from a different pipeline file with a workflow call. Now, before we go anywhere, I'd like to ask you guys to please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done it so, and also to like the video because, the support really helps me, especially when I'm spending my own money to make these videos for free for everyone out there. So thank you very much. You should already know that GitHub Action workflows or pipelines are essentially just a YAML file defining what the pipeline runners will do. For example, what scripts they will be running on a terminal, how to essentially check out your repository, and so on and so forth. And for this reason, you should probably know where to find out what you can put in this file here, right? Because it's very important. And this is where the GitHub Actions documentation comes in. In this page, you will find a starting point to figure out whatever settings you can have in there. So let's talk about the first trigger. So I want to show you guys how you can run your pipeline every time there is a push on a branch. So specifically, we're talking about the first section here. So on push branches. And we can see here on the equivalent documentation page, if you just click on push, there's a bunch of modes here. So obviously this doesn't have to be a single value. This is actually a list. So in branches here, you can have multiple branches. You can also have rejects on that branch. So on their example, you can see here that you can trigger on all of the release branches. And you can also exclude certain branches if you use the not operator here. So this excludes all the alpha releases. And what's even more interesting is that branches is not the only thing. You can also have tags here, for example, and this will trigger on any tag. So if you have like a release tag, doing something like this is going to run on every release tag that you have. In other words, every time you push a new commit, either to main here, or if you create tags with this name and push commits to them, your pipeline will also run. This is a very nice and very basic one. Everyone should have at least the branches main enabled here because that's going to make sure your pipeline is running for every commit on main. And that is basically it. But the takeaway is that if you want to enable your pipelines to be running on commits on a particular branch, this is what to use, right? The second thing we will learn about is obviously something we already had, and you can probably guess correctly, is going to be the pull requests. So this pull request trigger section here is going to make sure that your pipeline runs every time there is a new pull request or a change to a pull request that targets main. So every time you create a new pull request, your pipeline is going to be running on that PR. So every time you do a new commit on that PR, this will also trigger. And again, this is kind of the same thing as push here. You can have like multiple branches, you can have some rejectors, and go crazy here, do what you want. But at the very least, you're probably going to want to have something like this. So every time that there is a new PR targeting main, you want to run the pipeline because you want to make sure that the code is up to standards to be merged into main. So this is what I recommend. And what you can see here, the combination of the push and pull request triggers is the absolute minimal settings that you can have for a nice pipeline trigger, in my opinion. In other words, every time you merge something onto main, you'll be running the pipeline. And every time you want to merge something onto main, you will also be running the pipeline, which means you will be checking the code, right? Now, there's nothing new here. We actually saw this in the last video. So I just wanted to explain a little bit more about what these things mean. Once again, check out the documentation for any of these things if you want to find out more. Now, if you're a very, very smart person, you're probably questioning, wouldn't this cause a same pipeline to run twice? In other words, when you create a pull request onto main, it will run a pull request. And assuming that succeeded, and then you merge that pull request onto main, there will also be a new commit onto main, right? So essentially it is going to run the merge pipeline twice here. And to be honest with you guys, yes, this is going to cause some repetition when you merge APR, but there is a way we can fix this. It's a little bit convoluted, so we're not going to explain it very well. But every time you have your jobs here, you can kind of add what we call a condition. So if you copy and paste this code here, again, the link of this whole thing is going to be on the description, so you can check that out. So in this case, what we're actually checking is that the build job is going to run when the event type is not a pull request. In other words, whenever it's getting merged onto main, that's the only other place when it's not a pull request. Or when the GitHub pull request head repo full name is not the same as GitHub event pull request base repo full name. Well, if you didn't get that, this essentially means that it's a commit from a pull request that is not going onto main. So in other words, this condition is going to make it so your pipeline doesn't run twice when your pull request is being merged onto main. So it doesn't get merged on the main commit. Now moving on, let's talk about scheduled pipelines. So let's say you want to run a nightly build every day at midnight when there's no one else coding, when there's no one else pushing anything to your GitHub. What do you do? Well, you do a nightly build to make sure that nothing was broken during the day, and you can perhaps create a nice release binary at the end of it. You can do that with on schedules. It's actually a very simple syntax, but on the UI, you will see something like this. So if I go into my actions, you can see here that I have a nightly build, which is not really attached to any pull request, any commit or anything. It just runs automatically at a given time on my main branch, right? And you can see here, it actually run at around 1 a.m. yesterday. So if you know cron, you know the language of intervals, then you'll be fine with this. So basically you put schedule on the on here, and under the schedule, you actually pass the cron string, right? So which is the POSIX cron string. You don't necessarily have to only have one of them. You can have multiple crons here, so you can run it at multiple intervals. But I'm going to focus on only one of them here, right? Long story short, this string that you see here means that whatever task this is doing, it should be running at midnight every single day. So how do I know that? Well, I kind of just know a little bit of POSIX cron, but if you don't know what this means and you want to create a similar string, but for a different time, a different day, or a different interval, there is this really helpful website called the Cron Tab Guru. And in here, you can kind of just play with the values and then it will tell you what it means. So for example, if I wanted to run at, let's say 11:30 every day, every Monday, I could do something like this. So this is the minute, right? I'm going to put it to 30 here. I'm going to put it to 11. Micron essentially just means that the task will be running at 11:30 every day on Monday. And there's a bunch of other things you can learn about as well. I'm not going to bother explaining it, but just check out this website and use it if you want to do a cron schedule here. So just to summarize everything here, having an on schedule with a cron is just going to run it at whatever interval you give it here. So in my case, it was meant to be running at midnight yesterday on UTC time, which is actually quite interesting because if I look at my pipeline, it ran an hour after that, right? It seems like the GitHub scheduler for free accounts at the very least doesn't really have any guarantees on time precision. So you might not actually get it to run at that time, but this is fine for nightly builds because, it essentially can run anytime on a late hour. So as long as you put something like midnight there, you should be okay, right? And according to the documentation of GitHub as well, the shortest interval you can do is to run something every 5 minutes. Now, a very interesting question would be, I've got all of these workflows here that I can see, but if I click on any one of them, for example, the C++ build one, I can't actually run it manually on the UI. And this is true, I can't do that by default unless you have the workflow dispatch trigger. The workflow dispatch looks something like this. So again, it's just going to be another section on your on here. You can still have push and pull requests, of course, but then you have to specify workflow dispatch, right? We'll go over the inputs in a bit, but if you just do workflow dispatch, you should be able to see it on the GitHub Actions UI now, that you have the ability to now run the workflow. And this is what causes this to be available. Workflow dispatch allows you to run things manually. And if I expand it here, I can see that I have two variables. So my first name and my second name, right? So this is where those inputs come in. So you can have inputs to it, where you can have manual inputs. I'm going to refer back to documentation. Feel free to see what fields you can have here, but you're definitely going to need to have description, whether or not it's required, and maybe a default value if it makes sense, right? And the interesting thing is that whatever inputs you have here, you can actually refer to them on the actual step. So for example, I could have a step here that's just echoing my first and second name, just like this. And this would essentially display my first and second name on the pipeline. This is a fairly standard syntax. You just have the $sign and two open and close brackets with the input in the middle here. But if you run the pipeline, you can see, it will just run it normally as if it was triggered by a commit or something. But instead, of course, you just triggered it with your hands. And finally, on this video, I also want to talk about the workflow call. This is not something that you will see on the code base at the moment because it is a bigger topic that we'll be going through on a future video. Although it looks very similar to workflow dispatch, it serves a very different purpose. So workflow call is used for when you want to reuse that pipeline. And the syntax kind of looks like this. You would have the workflow call inputs with whatever inputs you have here. And when it comes to reusing, you probably do something like this. You define your job, but then there's this really nice keyword called users. And this is where you actually refer to the template workflow you've just created and the variables under here. Again, we're not going to go through this in this video because we're still on the basics. And this is a little bit more advanced topic that grants its own video. I'm going to leave that to later, and I'll give you an actual example of how useful this is. But it's there just so you're aware of it. Now, before we wrap up, I just want to say that all of the code that you've seen in this video and that we've talked about will be on the GitHub repository here. I've pasted the link in the description. Just bear in mind that this is a tag. So I'm actually following this format where each video is going to have their own tag on the GitHub. So for example, this one is part 2 on triggers. So if you click on that, you'll be able to access all the code as we've seen in this video. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and don't forget to post in the comments anything that you may be struggling with. I may be able to help you, or if you have any feedback for the future videos of the series, I appreciate that very much. And I guess I'll see you guys next week, and bye-bye.